She didn't ask questions. Vivian Blackthorn just fired Red Dawson in front of everyone. All because he was 47 minutes late. On their biggest morning in a decade, she never asked why. The single father didn't plead, and she didn't ask. He unclipped his badge and placed a scorched component on her desk with the quiet precision of someone who had done far more that morning than she ever bothered to find out. Right after he walked out, the floor manager rushed over, his face completely pale. "You just fired the man who spent all night fixing your Ferrari." Vivian spun toward the window just as his engine turned over. Clean, smooth, and silent as a bitter accusation. The component he left wasn't just a repair, it was proof she should have asked why. Stick around to see who sabotaged that Ferrari, and why she fired him for being late without asking why. The morning that changed. Everything at Blackthorn Velocity Motors started like any high-stakes morning does, with people rushing around blindly, saying much less than they actually meant, and holding their breath, dreading outcomes they couldn't possibly control. The technical center in Westbridge, Michigan, hummed with a very specific tension, the kind that thrives under fluorescent lights and stiff, pressed collars, and the sharp click of heels on concrete because Vivian Blackthorn arrived before anyone else. And when this demanding CEO arrived early, it never meant good news. She had exactly 3 things on her mind while walking the floor. The international partners flying in to finalize a $300 million collaboration. The board members who had been quietly circling her leadership since a prototype failed the previous week. And the 1963 Ferrari 250 GT Lusso her late father drove to every major milestone. The very car she planned to drive to the signing ceremony that afternoon. The Ferrari had been brought in last night with an engine fault nobody could fully explain. A strange rumble in the power delivery that felt wrong and hard to pinpoint, but absolutely impossible to ignore. And when she demanded a status update, her floor manager Malcolm Whitaker assured her it was already handled, that some technician had worked all night and the car was ready. What she didn't know and never bothered to ask was exactly who that man was, and exactly what he sacrificed to make that car run clean by morning. Red Dawson walked through the main doors at 7:47, 47 minutes after his shift started, wearing a wrinkled shirt with heavy eyes that hadn't been closed all night, and the quiet stillness of someone who'd finished a full day's work before breakfast. He walked across the floor without rushing and without excuses, with no sign that he even noticed the silence freezing around him. The way heads turned in conversations died as hands froze over clipboards. Vivian saw him and immediately assumed the worst, feeling an anger she rarely allowed. She felt the quiet certainty of being disrespected, not loudly but in the most insulting way possible. The kind that assumes you won't notice or won't take action. She had been awake since 5 in the that morning carried the weight of a deal to save 300 jobs. It could position Blackthorn as a top performance manufacturer in North America. And a dedicated employee who had worked there for 6 years chose this morning, of all mornings, to walk in nearly an hour late without a word. She confronted him right in the middle of the floor, right where everyone could see, believing that public examples had to be made. To her, letting one mistake go in private just invited a dozen more in public. She demanded to know why he was late, completely devoid of warmth. Rhett just looked at her, his face totally unreadable. He was calculating whether she would even hear his explanation. Between the gathering crowd and the partners arriving in just a few hours, he could tell her mind was already made up. It wouldn't matter. Anything he said would just look like an excuse on their most important day. So he gave her the simple truth without trying to defend his lateness. "I finished what needed to be done." That wasn't what Vivian wanted to hear. It sounded exactly as she feared. It felt like pure arrogance. Just then, Laurel Winslow stepped up. She held a tablet and quietly checked the digital attendance records. She quietly noted the system showed no record of Rhett working after hours. The logs showed he had clocked out right at his regular time. Vivian demanded to know if treating his schedule as optional was a habit. Rhett calmly replied that he had not been late once in 6 years. She snapped that a perfect record did not make up for today's lateness. She fired him right then and there in front of the entire staff. She used that cold, calculated tone that made her decisions feel absolutely final. Rhett didn't argue, raise his voice, or ask to speak in private. He simply unclipped his security badge and set it on a nearby desk. He handed over his tool key as calmly as passing a wrench to a coworker. Then he pulled a small, burnt component from his pocket and set it on her desk. A ruined part. It was blackened on one edge, its company serial number barely visible as he spoke. Without looking at anyone, he quietly said Malcolm would understand what it was. Then he turned and walked toward the exit with steady steps. He moved with the quiet dignity of a man who was already done talking. No one stopped him, no one said a word. The entire floor remained dead silent until the outer gate clicked shut. Then the silence shattered, not from the CEO but from Malcolm Whitaker. He rushed through the back bay doors and stopped in his tracks. He stared at the termination paperwork in HR's hand like he was looking at a disaster. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just stood in the middle of the room and spoke. He spoke with the undeniable steadiness of someone who has no reason to lie. "You just fired the man who spent all night fixing your Ferrari." Vivian froze completely. Malcolm picked up the burnt part Rhett left behind, leaving her realizing she never asked why. Then he whispered just as quietly, "This part was never on the car when it left the factory." The night before she fired him began at 6:53 p.m., when her Ferrari arrived on a flatbed. Its engine was throwing a horrific sound, something Malcolm said would absolutely terrify you on the highway. CEO Vivian made herself crystal clear. The car had to run by 8 a.m. because she fully intended to drive it herself in front of international partners to make a massive power statement about her father's company and the legacy she was desperate to honor. But by then, almost the entire technical crew had gone home. Only a few junior rookies remained, guys who only knew performance engines from textbooks, not reality. They could repeat the principles, but they couldn't actually hear the real issue. So Malcolm called Rhett, a dedicated single dad. He was the only expert on the floor who had spent years tuning race cars before Blackthorn. He had once worked as a lead calibration engineer on elite endurance racing teams before trading that high-stress world for a stable job raising his kid. And he could diagnose a misfire just by the gap between the engine pulses. For Rhett, it was pure instinct, not a manual. Rhett was literally packing up to head home when that fateful call came. He was already planning when to pick up his young daughter, Mila. She was 13 and used to his late shifts, but she still hated the uncertainty. He quickly called a relative to watch Mila for the night. He double-checked the plans, then headed right back to the bay with that quiet and settled focus that every single coworker immediately recognized. It was a sure sign that the problem was about to get solved. He worked through it systematically, starting at the ignition system and the timing chain, checking the distributor cap and tracing every single wire in the firing sequence. But what he uncovered over the next several hours of grueling work was not some accidental engine failure from a car sitting in storage too long. The spark plugs were firing unevenly because the timing signal was completely off. It wasn't a weak connection, it was a wrong pattern that didn't match normal wear. Even the distributor had bizarre scratch marks that screamed manual tampering. Someone had forced a foreign sensor into the intake, an assembly that had absolutely no business being there. It was a modern chip hidden behind vintage parts, wired in to silently wreck the engine. Sabotage, plain and simple. Malcolm looked at the evidence and nervously tried to downplay it, hoping there was a simple, harmless explanation for what they saw. He suggested that maybe a previous mechanic just forgot to log a swap. But Rhett didn't buy it. He quietly turned the device over in his hands, staring at it in disbelief. This wasn't some lazy, rushed repair done by accident. It had been done cleanly and precisely by someone who knew exactly how to hide their tracks. He spent the rest of his night restoring the original vintage configuration as closely as the available spare parts allowed, and discarded the sabotaged component entirely. He carefully documented everything in his shift report, saving codes and photo evidence on his phone. But when he hit submit, the system blocked him with a strange permissions error that sealed his fate. An error flag that never should have touched his account. Malcolm promised he would log the overnight request manually come morning. He claimed it was a common glitch, telling Rhett not to worry. Close to dawn, Rhett studied the part's serial numbers under a single lamp. There he spotted a familiar code, a C9, a label he had seen on secret Tempest R project documents, a program he had absolutely no authorization to view. He snapped a photo, logged the details, and left the component for Malcolm to find. But there was a critical detail Malcolm missed, one that would ruin everything, namely, that the company's secure internal database had been hacked by an admin login right before the morning shift started. And those login credentials belonged to neither of them. Rhett left at 6:51 a.m., the Ferrari purring perfectly behind him. He drove home and showered, only to find out Mila's babysitter had suddenly canceled. No explanation was given, just a cold text as he grabbed his keys. He rushed Mila to a relative's house, then hit brutal bridge traffic. He walked into Blackthorn Velocity Motors 47 minutes late, holding zero proof of his delay and zero desire to argue. She realized her mistake minutes later, but the public damage was already done. Hearing the truth from Malcolm, she turned to her assistant. A cold, terrifying panic took over her, far worse than any anger. She had to fix her massive mistake immediately, before it became permanent. Her assistant confirmed her worst fears, a dread that had gripped her soul the second she saw Malcolm's guilty face. The firing was official. The system had already wiped his record. Rhett's ID credentials were deactivated in the standard automated lockout. And though she could technically undo the system block, she could never erase the humiliation she had just caused. She could cancel the firing papers, but she couldn't erase the memory of her entire staff watching their best mechanic walk out after 6 loyal years, leaving with nothing but a burned car part and his silence. She called his phone directly, no answer. She begged him to come back in an urgent text, pleading for his mechanical expertise. His cold response arrived through Malcolm an hour later, delivered in silence, the way people pass along messages they dread to read aloud. I am not coming back. To a place that values a badge or a car more than my side of the story. She slowly sat down, staring in silence at the sleek Ferrari. It sat gleaming in the showroom, completely fixed and ready. She realized how much the car couldn't tell her, and all the questions she had failed to ask. The big launch went ahead because they had no choice. Investors were waiting, and the contracts were already signed. Canceling now would have cost them far more than she was willing to risk. She drove the Ferrari to the venue herself, exactly as planned. It ran flawlessly, just as the man she fired had left it. It purred with the quiet perfection of a machine fixed with real care, not just patched up to pass her quick inspection. But she couldn't stop obsessing over the mysterious part Malcolm had brought to her desk. She couldn't stop turning over the reality that a rogue part had been deliberately planted inside that car by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and had been discovered, then removed by the single father she fired the next morning, before he could explain why it even mattered. Inside the showroom, during the big reveal of her Tempest R prototype, the thermal monitoring screen flagged a critical error in the engine system. Graham Prescott, her lead engineer, spotted the alert and moved instantly, silencing the warning before any of her VIP partners could notice. Then he stood completely frozen for the rest of the presentation, looking like a man doing a calculation he still did not have all the numbers for. Across the room, her COO, Sterling Ashcombe, watched closely, with the smug look of someone who expected this all along. He had been waiting for it. Just like a captain watching for a landmark they already knew was coming. Over the next few days, Sterling spun the story with perfect, calculated control. The elegant way he handled everything, softly nudging her with clever suggestions, instead of telling outright lies to her face. He told her, and later the board, that the fired father was just a bitter technician, and that his late night at work wasn't out of loyalty, claiming that a man leaving a strange part on her desk as he was kicked out was making a threat, not a report. He promised her the damage was easily contained, and that they shouldn't turn a disgruntled worker's grudge into a massive corporate scandal. Then he casually mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his own firm was ready to take over the testing for the Tempest R at a fraction of their current development schedule. Meanwhile, Malcolm quietly checked the security footage. What he found was a suspicious 12-minute blackout in the overnight video. right when the fired father had pulled out and photographed that hidden part. Worse, the digital key used to approve that late-night building access belonged to a junior assistant who reported directly to her manipulative COO, Sterling Ashcombe. Meanwhile, the fired single father returned to a home that was far too quiet. The heavy silence that settles over a house built for 4 but now holding only 2. And he sat at the kitchen table for hours, completely lost in his thoughts. His daughter, Mila, came home from school and dropped her backpack down, staring at him with the sharp eyes of a teenager who had learned to read her father's pain before starting her homework, asking with a timid, gentle voice she reserved for the things she feared most if he was okay. He quietly told her that his boss simply didn't need his help anymore, which was true only in the coldest, narrowest sense. He also promised her he would figure out their next move, and he meant it. He told her not to worry about losing their home, though he secretly wondered how they would survive. Mila nodded, carried her backpack upstairs, and soon the faint scratching of her pencil filled the quiet house. It was the familiar sound she always made when keeping her heavy thoughts to herself. He just sat there, listening, letting the silence settle before he forced himself to plan their future. Right on cue, a rival car company, Carradine Apex, called with an offer. News of his public firing had traveled fast in their small, gossipy industry. In this world, competitors track every corporate casualty like sharks smelling blood in the water. Their job offer was massive. It was clearly designed by someone who had spent hours studying his exact situation, calculating the perfect price to make a desperate single dad with a mortgage sign the contract immediately before asking too many questions about what he was selling out. Triple his old pay plus his own private lab. Unlimited access to elite vehicle testing programs. The catch? A massive bonus if he handed over proprietary secrets from his former employer. Rhett heard them out, then flatly refused to betray his ethics for the extra cash. The recruiter backtracked quickly, claiming they wanted nothing illegal, and said the base salary was still his. Hanging up, Rhett felt a heavy weight. The tempting escape route was still wide open. He had not shut them down completely. After all, proud principals do not pay for a little girl's bright future. 3 days after being fired, Vivian Blackthorn tracked him down to a gritty, independent auto shop where he was turning wrenches to stay busy. It was a no-nonsense local garage smelling of motor oil and hard work, far removed from her pristine executive offices. She arrived alone, without her entourage or any legal paperwork. Stripped of her corporate power and cold arrogance, the humbled CEO pleaded for a chance to explain. He met her with silence. The heavy, judging quiet reserved for bosses who destroy lives first and ask questions later. She babbled about missing computer records and the immense pressure she was under, admitting she had fired him based on rumors she never bothered to verify. When she stopped, he asked, "Are you sorry because I fixed the luxury car? Or because you realized you fired the wrong man?" The painful question hung in the air, unanswered for too long. Her hesitation revealed the ugly truth. She quietly confessed she had treated a devoted father's livelihood like a minor box to check on a production schedule. It was not malicious, but it was still a devastating mistake. But he did not agree to return. Instead, he demanded answers to 4 critical questions before he would ever consider walking back through her corporate doors. First, who deleted the overnight logs? Second, who planted the unauthorized parts in her father's vehicle? Third, what did the marking AC9 mean for the Tempest R project? And finally, why was a critical heat warning silenced without any logged authorization? Vivian stared at him, stunned, before whispering, "You know far more about my company than I do." He replied, "That should have been impossible, but they reached a deal." Rhett would inspect the sabotaged vehicle as an outside consultant, on his own terms, with Malcolm watching. He logged every finding on his device in the main system, ensuring the records were locked down tight. That evening, the exhausted father pulled the Ferrari's onboard memory. Deep in the data, he spotted a hidden log entry. The car's proximity sensors had triggered inside the secure bay at 2:13 in the morning, exactly 3 days before the fault was reported. Someone had remotely accessed and unlocked it, in the dead of night, by someone whose credentials the system accepted without a second thought. Only 4 people held active credentials for that private bay: Vivian herself, the security chief Malcolm, and Sterling Ashcombe. When Vivian called an afternoon meeting, Sterling was confronted with it. He offered a smooth excuse, claiming his keycard must have been copied without his knowledge, and noted that the security camera covering the bay entrance coincidentally went dark that very night. Unfortunate, he said, but not suspicious, since hardware failures in that wing are a documented issue. He said all of this with the calculated ease of a man who had prepared his story. Rhett picked up on it, but stayed completely silent, while Vivian quietly filed it away, piecing together a larger picture of the betrayal she couldn't yet prove. Malcolm said absolutely nothing during that meeting. But afterward he tracked Rhett down and whispered two chilling words. What followed was the high-stakes diagnostic work engineers do when lives are on the line, leaving nothing behind but the cold, hard evidence. Working through the night, Rhett and Graham compared the parts. Graham was hesitant at first, terrified that whatever they uncovered would instantly destroy the project he had spent 2 long years of his life building. But as the damning data piled up, he had to accept the truth. The faulty part, pulled from the Ferrari, was a scaled-down copy of the critical thermal module inside their new Tempest R prototype. Built the same way, failing the exact same way. Both glitched dangerously under a sustained load in a way that never showed up during short tests, making them a ticking time bomb on the highway. Officially, the prototype's module had passed its safety certification, at least according to the official files. But the real internal numbers Graham generated, not the doctored data submitted in the formal reports, revealed a terrifying failure rate no real engineer would ever approve. Exhausted from carrying this heavy secret, Graham finally confessed everything to the young father. He had flagged this critical safety defect in writing 4 months ago, only for his warning to be sent back by Sterling's office with a note claiming the data wasn't strong enough to prove a defect, and that their tight launch timeline didn't allow for a supplier review. He didn't go over his boss's head because Sterling completely controlled his career, and because he hesitated. He had a family to feed and made the quiet calculation we all make when the price of speaking up is just too high to pay. Rhett didn't judge him, because playing moral police wasn't going to fix this massive corporate cover-up. The unfolding truth was both precise and terrifying. A strange foreign part stuffed inside her beloved car, rigged to fail publicly on the exact day the CEO took the wheel. That same bad part was inside a prototype meant for a $300 million deal. Testing records were faked to hide the critical flaws, and the only man who found the first warning sign, fixed the issue and tried his best to report it, was thrown out of the building before she even heard him out. If her vintage Ferrari had broken down at the signing, the fallout would have been absolutely devastating. That Vivian's team couldn't even keep a classic car running, that her flagship prototype was built on hidden risks, and that she was no longer fit to lead. The perfect solution they would have offered next. A certified new supplier waiting in the wings, Ashcombe Performance Systems, the exact company where Sterling held a secret financial interest he hid from the board. Rhett stared at the sabotaged part for a long time before speaking. His voice was quiet but precise. Sterling wasn't just trying to embarrass you. He wanted to make you a liability, Rhett added, and I was the one who got in the way. Listening from the doorway, Vivian stood frozen and silent for a long moment. Then she finally asked him what he thought they should do. He replied, "Cancel tomorrow morning's test." She immediately asked him why. "Because the paperwork has your signature," he said, "and you told me you never signed it." And she did just that. Vivian halted the test with an order sent straight to the floor, bypassing Sterling's office completely. The prototype sat idle as the forged signature escalated from a simple technical error to a major security investigation in under 40 minutes. Sterling arrived looking calm and collected, ready for a fight, though it came sooner than expected. He confidently made his case in the boardroom, right in front of the board liaison. The test was scheduled, and the partners had already been notified. Any delay now would ruin a massive deal just 72 hours before closing, and any actual proof of a setup was purely circumstantial at best. Worse, the accusations came from a fired worker who was, as Sterling pointed out, secretly talking with their rival Carradine Apex. He wasn't wrong about that, and a heavy silence fell over the room. So Rhett was called in to show his evidence directly to the board liaison. Vivian finally understood, with the cold clarity that comes when everything is on the line, that she could not stand alone in this fight. If she was the only one pointing the finger, Sterling would just spin it as a petty clash between two jealous executives. And the board would do exactly what boards do when they smell trouble. Choose blind certainty over the truth. Rhett stood before them with no fancy presentation and zero slides. Careless about the corporate politics he was stepping into, he simply laid out the raw data. Thermal failure rates, erratic signal timelines, and the physical proof from the Ferrari. The paper trail, the access logs, a 12-minute camera gap, a wiped overtime entry. He said, "Don't just take my word for it. Look at the numbers they paid for, and then buried." Graham Prescott confirmed the test data from his personal records. The board liaison asked, with that smug skepticism of someone asking a question just to dismiss the answer, not to learn, "How much weight does a fired mechanic's word carry on a massive project like this?" Rhett replied, "The credibility of a man who caught this disaster before anyone in this room even knew to look." Sterling laid out what he discovered about Rhett's secret meetings with Caradine Apex. Documented, factual details that Rhett had kept completely hidden. He spun the narrative with the cold precision of a master storyteller. A bitter technician, denied a promotion, runs straight to a rival company. He creates a crisis by accessing a high-end vehicle. Plays the hero who fixed it just to get close to the CEO. Then inserts a massive technical risk into a highly sensitive deal in a way that, by pure coincidence, benefits the exact competitor he was secretly talking to. It was a perfect web of truths designed to paint a completely false picture. Vivian felt the room sway toward the easy explanation, the one that excused her own hasty mistake. Rhett admitted, "I talked to them. But I didn't sign a thing, and I never shared company secrets." Vivian asked why he hadn't told her. He looked at her steadily. "You fired me. What I did with my free time after that wasn't yours to judge." A cold, sharp wall rose between them once again, and they both felt its weight. Suddenly, Malcolm's voice cut in from the corner. He stood there, holding a tablet displaying a critical batch verification record. The AC9 component from the Ferrari bore a microstamp matching a testing batch that Ashcom Performance Systems had. Certified as destroyed 8 months ago. Sterling stared down at the tablet. For the first time in the entire meeting, he sat there completely speechless, and that silence was his confession. Malcolm addressed the board for 22 minutes straight, entirely without notes. It was the kind of raw testimony that carries real weight because it's completely unpolished. He wasn't trying to spin a story, he was simply telling them the honest truth. He described the night Rhett stayed, the desperate call, his hesitation. The plans made so a single father with a 13-year-old daughter could return to a dark shop floor at 7 p.m. and labor until nearly 7 a.m. on a car that wasn't his. All for a CEO he'd never even met simply because his manager asked him to. And simply because that was the kind of man he was. He explained the computer glitch that blocked Rhett from submitting his overnight overtime. Malcolm's own promise to log those hours manually the next morning. Only to show up and find the firing already in motion. The missing hours already erased. And the decision already irreversible, the way proud corporate choices always are, regardless of the facts. Then he delivered a brutal truth the board desperately needed to hear, completely unfiltered. Someone already knew Rhett would be late that morning. They knew even before he did. Laurel Winslow spent the last 2 days auditing our HR files. Driven by professional duty and my own growing dread over a termination I was no longer confident in. What she uncovered was a sequence that simply doesn't happen naturally. The tardiness report on Rhett was entered in our system at 7:12 that morning, 35 minutes before he arrived. His termination file had metadata showing it was filled out the night before his overnight shift had even finished. Sterling's technical assistant had submitted a digital request to monitor the attendance on Rhett's specific employee ID at 11:47 p.m. and the phone call Rhett made to my office, the one he made from his car while rushing, the call I never actually received, was routed to a general queue and flagged low priority by a system change made that morning. This was not impulsive, this was highly engineered. Someone knew Rhett would finish his overnight shift, knew his childcare setup was highly unpredictable, and knew our system gaps would leave him without proof. They designed a trap of decision points that would lead me to the conclusion I reached, without anyone ever having to lie to me directly. Sterling didn't create the childcare emergency. He wasn't the one who canceled the babysitter. But the backup care service Rhett relied on was managed by a vendor network Laurel later linked directly to an Ashcombe subsidiary. Whether that cancellation was deliberately set up or just convenient, the trap built around it was entirely deliberate. I sat with this realization in a way that demanded something far deeper than mere anger. It forced me to look past Sterling and face my own bad decisions, finding the exact moments where I had handed over operational authority to a man whose loyalty I accepted blindly because the alternative meant shifting my focus away from other critical tasks. I gave Sterling power over procurement because I was busy managing the financing structure of a $300 deal, trusting our system to hold. I blindly signed off on the Ashcombe contract expansion without personally checking the supplier disclosure forms, because my desk was buried under 4 active crises and that deal looked clean in the summary. I presented these facts to the board not as a defense, not to shift blame to Sterling, but to account for my own mistakes. I told them I signed the termination. Sterling manipulated the data, but I was the one who chose not to verify. A board member stared at me the way people look at someone doing something completely unexpected, and the room went dead silent. Then Sterling spoke with the calm of a man who still believed he held the final card, claiming that admitting my failure was not the same as finding a path forward. My company still needed a decision about the test run, the partnership, and the supplier. And none of those decisions were going to wait for some slow, multi-week investigation. He smirked. The deal doesn't close without me. And technically the man wasn't wrong. He had spent 2 years building himself directly into the architecture of our agreement, which, as Brett finally understood, had been his plan all along. The board gave me the choice on the exact terms they always use. The safe path, protect our current deal and look the other way. Or the correct path, disrupt everything even if it costs my company. More than anyone was sure we could actually absorb. Several directors argued that not a single vehicle had actually failed yet, that the Ferrari was repaired before anyone got hurt, that the module in the Tempest R had not caused any incidents yet, and that a proactive 6-week delay was completely different from a legally forced defect disclosure. One member spoke with the smug authority of someone who survived tough quarters before. We can replace the part quietly and protect the timeline. Another added, we have no legal obligation to disclose a potential issue that exists only in internal testing. Brett had no fortune to offer me, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He was just a mechanic who spent all night fixing a car and found a truth he couldn't ignore. But he had a solid plan: replace the AC9 module across the entire Tempest R system, delay our launch by 6 weeks, order an independent validation from an outside testing house, source replacement components from a supplier with zero ties to any current executive, then invite our global partners to observe the validation process directly, disclosing the delay as a quality enhancement rather than a defect correction. It was expensive, slow, and completely honest. It's the difference between a real company that survives a crisis by managing it and a cowardly one that survives by pretending nothing happened until the disaster is too loud to ignore. I stared down my board and made the call without any drama, the same cold tone I used when I fired Red Dawson for being late, which, as Brett quietly noted, was the most fitting symmetry. I suspended Sterling Ashcombe from all operational duties pending an independent investigation into his procurement irregularities, unauthorized system access and falsification of certification data, and his hidden financial ties to Ashcombe Performance Systems. Sterling's composure broke for the first and only time in that room. He hissed that I was making a decision to end my tenure, that my board couldn't survive the market's reaction to a voluntary delay of this scale, that I was handing my company over to people who didn't understand what they were protecting. I looked at him without any of the fake strength that arrogant leaders use to show they are not afraid and said, If keeping this seat requires me to put an unsafe vehicle on the road, you can have the seat. But the total disaster Sterling had promised never actually came. The overseas partners, called directly by Vivian within the hour, refused to back out. They already had data showing that Ashcombe Performance Systems had sent them fake specification files that did not match the actual parts in their pipeline. A major warning sign they had been quietly debating for 3 weeks. So they agreed to the delay and welcomed an independent review. They even offered a new deal that cut Ashcombe out entirely, making Blackthorn stronger than ever. The deal was not dead. It just changed shape, and the new version was actually much better. 3 days later, Malcolm found the final piece of evidence in Sterling's files. An email sent to a top manager at Carradine Apex 11 months earlier detailing a plan to sabotage Vivian Blackthorn so she would be replaced by temporary board managers. And then, the rights to the Tempest R project would be sold off dirt cheap, framing the firm as a failing business instead of a massive success. Sterling was never trying to build Blackthorn up. He wanted to smash it to pieces and sell off the scraps. The official investigation took 3 weeks, and when it finally wrapped up, Sterling Ashcombe was thrown out of the company, losing all his performance bonuses. His name was erased from every board and committee, and he was handed over to the police for corporate fraud, for forging critical safety documents, and massive conflicts of interest that would take years in court to sort out. He went quietly into the night. He slipped away the way guilty men always do when the hard evidence finally drops. Just a cold lawyer's statement and absolute silence. The public record was corrected instantly, as soon as it became legally safe to do so. And their official press release confirmed that Red Dawson was actually doing a fully approved repair that fateful night. They admitted his work records had been illegally altered. She had fired him on the spot, based entirely on falsified information. Now his unfair firing was officially overturned. To make amends, Vivian created a brand new director of technical safety role, a position with complete independent authority, and she offered it directly to Red in writing, with terms that actually reflected the demands of the job. Instead of just saving company money, Red read her offer and quietly thought about it, the way he always did, taking his time to figure out his next move. Then he sent his reply, neither accepting nor declining her offer. Instead, he laid down hard conditions that made the new job truly powerful. He wrote, "No worker can be fired without 48 hours to explain their side. And late-night shifts must be verified by 2 separate systems, not just one. Safety reports could no longer be bypassed from the same biased chain of command she had blindly trusted. Whistleblower protections were now written directly into contracts, not ignored in handbooks. And critical go or no-go launch decisions could never be tied to financial bonuses for those making decisions." Vivian agreed to all 5 terms, bringing them directly to her board. As part of the governance reforms she announced that week. Her actual apology, not a hollow legal statement, happened right in the busy production bay, in front of the same crew who saw her humiliate Rhett 3 weeks prior. Vivian walked out to the center of the floor and spoke with the humility she should have shown the morning she fired him. By owning up to her absolute failure before trying to explain it, she confessed that she only saw a man arriving late, on the most critical day for her business, assuming his lateness was the only thing that mattered. That snap judgment was a failure she now owned without any excuses. Not because her manager had twisted the facts, though he did, but because she never stopped to ask why. She told them, "I saw a man walk in late and never once asked why. That blind spot is mine." The bay was silent. Rhett stood to the side, refusing to make the moment about him. He agreed to return as an independent consultant, with a 6-month review and a formal agreement that either side could change the contract at that point with 0 penalty, because a title could never instantly repair a broken culture. And that culture was still so fragile that it had to prove these changes, not just announce them to the press. 6 months later, Blackthorn Velocity Motors looked like a firm that had survived a major storm and knew it. The Tempest R aced independent testing, earning certification from 2 different safety boards, with both safety reports noting that the thermal management system performed at the absolute top of its class and showed none of the dangerous flaws hidden in the suppressed data. Those hazardous AC9 modules were recalled, gone, and replaced, and stripped from every single car in the production line. The contract with Ashcombe Performance Systems was formally terminated, with the full relationship disclosed in a filing that would permanently stay on the record. Malcolm was handed full autonomy over the technical sign-off process, an authority he used with the same stubborn precision he brought to everything. Laurel completely rebuilt the disciplinary process from the bottom up, adding mandatory checks that required a second approval before any same-day firing. Graham presented his previously suppressed safety data to the full engineering committee, and finally, with deep relief, returned to the work of building cars he actually trusted. Meanwhile, Rhett settled into a routine that looked peaceful from the outside and was, from the inside, the first stable, peaceful life he had managed to build since his wife passed away. He was at my shop early every morning out of habit, but his daughter Mila's school events were always his true priority. And those two truths had, for the first time in years, finally stopped fighting against each other. He had started a training program for our younger technicians. Nothing formal, no credentials needed. Just an open bay afternoon twice a week, welcoming anyone who wanted to learn how to diagnose an engine problem simply by listening to it. That blackened AC9 component sat in a glass case on the shelf above his workstation. He kept it there not as a grievance but as a reminder, in the same way that my worst mistakes deserve to stay visible. Not because I celebrate them, but because forgetting what I did would cost far too much. On a Thursday morning in early spring, I brought my Ferrari back to his bay, claiming it was making a noise. He just listened to the engine at idle, under moderate load, and then at high throttle. He let it run in silence for a few minutes before telling me the car was completely fine. I looked at him for a quiet moment and confessed that I already knew it was fine, but just wanted to see if he would still look at it. He paused, holding my gaze, and asked, "Are you going to fire me if I tell you that you were worried for no reason?" I replied that I had learned to ask his floor manager first. From the far end of the bay, Malcolm called out, never looking up from the engine he was fixing, joking that this time he had actually shown up right on schedule. I offered him the keys, but he said the car wasn't his to drive. I told him I knew, but I was offering them anyway. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, feeling the warm leather, surrounded by the smell of oil and old aluminum, with my father's photograph still on the visor. Then he said, "Nobody inherits the right to something like this. You have to earn it every single time you pick up the keys." I got in right beside him. My Ferrari rolled out of the bay and into the pale morning light. And this time, nobody had to stay up all night to keep a hidden fault from turning into a disaster. The car ran perfectly clean because the work had been done right, and my company records were kept honest. Because I, the one responsible, had finally agreed to stop looking away from what was right in front of me.